Hey there, welcome to God Speaks Today. My name is Andy Croft and I work for a church called Soul Survivor in Watford. And on God Speaks Today, I want to look at whether or not the Bible's reliable, whether it's trustworthy. And one of the reasons I decided to do this is because the other day I was watching a program about rowers, Olympic athletes. And one of the things that was fascinating in the program is they were talking about not just the physical dynamic to the sport, but also the psychological battle that goes on. And they went on to say, and this is true of all sport, that confidence is absolutely key. You can look at someone and physically they look like they've got it all together. And actually two people who might play tennis against one another might be physically really very similar. But what gives people edge is having confidence. And for us as followers of Jesus, confidence is key. Not, in this case, self-confidence, but confidence in God, confidence in His goodness and in His faithfulness and in His love, and confidence in God's Word, trusting the Bible. I want to look specifically, as we look at trusting the Bible, at something incredibly basic, which is not so much the ethics and morality of the Scripture, although I do have total confidence in that, but confidence in the events of the Bible and whether or not they took place. I went to university at a place called Cambridge, and I was there with all these people who are well smart, much smarter than I was. And loads of them, when they found out I was a Christian, would ask me questions about the Bible and about whether it was reliable or not. And I found it a bit of a challenge, and I had to really think through what they were saying and take it seriously and go away and do some reading and study into it. But I've come back with a renewed sense of confidence that the events described in the Bible actually took place. And at heart, at root, what it is to believe the good news about Jesus is not primarily and first to believe in kind of a set of concepts or values or beliefs. It's more basic. It's to accept that the historical events described actually did happen. And there's a verse that comes in the Bible. We can find it in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, and it says, "But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason of the hope you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." And so whether you're watching this and you're a Christian or you're watching it and you're not, I want to try, if I can, just in a few minutes to give some of the reasons why I have confidence in this book and in the amazing message that it gives to us. It's easy to doubt the Bible on one level. It's understandable why people do today. So one reason for doubting it would be some of the events described seem a little bit weird. The fact that we believe that there's a God who became a Jewish bloke 2,000 years ago, that he was killed and then he came back to life again, does seem strange. And so it's understandable why people dismiss that offhand sometimes. Secondly, there are plenty of people today who proactively discredit the Bible, who actively say it's been twisted, it's been changed, it was never accurate in the first place. And there's plenty of them around. One of them would be a guy called Derren Brown, who occasionally pops up on television. This is a quote from him. "The Bible is not history. These stories continue to be edited, although contributed to by individuals. They were largely written by communities. It's one big game of Chinese whispers." And he's not the only one that would say that. A third reason why people sometimes question whether or not the Bible's trustworthy is just the way that it's taught in education. I don't know about you, but my RS lessons weren't inspiring in terms of the Bible having any sort of accurate basis. It just holds a whole load of religious texts up together in a lump, and often kind of the unspoken message is that they're either all equally valid or all equally false. And there's no real in-depth study of whether or not they've got any sort of basis in history. And a final reason is there are plenty of people today, whether they're Christians or not Christians, members of other religions, who would say the Bible has been twisted or changed over time. So maybe when it was written, there was something in it, but we don't have an accurate copy of that because 2,000 years later, lots of things have changed. How might we respond to that? Because we've only got a limited amount of time, I'm going to focus very particularly on a certain part of the Bible, the New Testament, and then within the New Testament, the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life. And my logic in that is that if Jesus is who the Gospels say he is, God himself, then the rest of the Bible can be built on that foundation in terms of trustworthiness. But if he isn't who the Gospels say he is, then there's no point paying attention to the rest anyway. There are two questions to ask. The first one is, do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament? So the New Testament was written down about 2,000 years ago. Is what we read today in the Bible that I have in my hand, in the Bible that many of us have on our phones, is it an accurate copy of, or has it been changed in that 2,000 years? And the second question is what, for example, Matthew, one of the gospel writers, is what Matthew wrote down just a made-up story? Can we tell, maybe we have an accurate copy of it, but we just have an accurate copy of something he totally made up off the top of his head? Do we have a way of knowing whether it's actually a story that was based in fact? Those are the two questions. The first one is easier to answer. Has the New Testament been changed over the years? Whenever we're assessing the reliability of any ancient document, and this isn't a Christian method, this is just a secular historical method, there are two things that we tend to look for to figure out whether the document has been changed over the years. The first one is the time gap between the original document being written and the earliest copy that we have. So when people wrote back in the day, they often wrote on something called papyrus, which would have the same sort of consistency as a piece of kitchen roll or a napkin. And so obviously it would degenerate after a while, and eventually it would be destroyed, it would be useless. To preserve the writing, it would have to be copied. So whenever we read an ancient author, we don't have the actual copy that they wrote. So we don't have, although we read Plato, we don't have something signed by Plato at the bottom, or Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, or Caesar, or even Shakespeare. We don't have the actual papyrus that they wrote on, or the paper that they used. We just have copies of it. And the smaller the time gap between the date that they were writing and the earliest copy we have, the more confident we can be that we have an accurate record. The second thing, if the first one is time gap, the second thing is number of copies. So obviously, the more copies we have, the more confident we can be that we're able to accurately record or reconstruct the original manuscript that was written. Let's look at some examples that can be compared to the New Testament. So one would be Caesar's Gallic War. These are letters that Julius Caesar wrote about his war in Gaul, and he wrote them about 50 to 55 BC. Caesar, when he was writing, obviously he was writing on paper that dissolved or faded away, and so we just have copies of it. The earliest copies we have, if we look at time gap, he wrote about 50 BC. The early copies we have are from 1000 AD, or 900 AD. So we're looking at 950 to 1000 years in terms of a time gap there. And we have 10 copies of that. Another example of an ancient author would be Tacitus, a Roman historian. He was writing about 60 years after Jesus was around, and we have about 20 copies of Tacitus's history, and most of them are dated, again, from about 1000 AD. So there's probably about a 900-year gap, again, with Tacitus and his history. The New Testament, and those are comparison, those are typical examples. The New Testament writings, you're looking at not a 1000 or 900-year gap between when they were written and the copies we have, but a 300-year gap, much, much smaller. And then within that, that's a full copy of the New Testament. Within that, for certain parts of the New Testament, it gets a lot smaller. The earliest fragment of the New Testament we have is a copy of John's Gospel from 130 AD, which is a time gap of just 40 years. So on a time gap comparison to any other ancient document, the New Testament is far and about much more accurate. The second one is copies. Tacitus's history, we said we've got 20 copies. Julius Caesar, we've got 10 copies of his letters. The second most copied author in history, ancient author, is Homer. And we have about 2,400 copies of his Odyssey and Iliad. He comes second to the writings of the New Testament. And with the New Testament, we have 24,000 copies of the New Testament writings from a very early stage. And that's me being conservative. Some people will go up to as many as 30,000. So what I'm saying is we can be as confident as possible, that more confident than we can with any other ancient document in history, that we have in this Bible an accurate copy of what Matthew wrote when he sat at his desk. To quote Sir Frederick Kenyon, who is the director of the British Museum, he said, "The interval between the dates of the original composition of the New Testament and the earliest excellent evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible." That's the first thing. We do have a copy of what Matthew wrote. The second question, and this is probably the harder one to answer, then becomes, but how do we know that what Matthew wrote was actually what happened? Maybe we have an accurate copy of a made-up story. And I cannot prove beyond all doubt that what Matthew wrote in his gospel is what actually happened, but I do believe that to be the case. And so I just want to give 5 very simple reasons, but reasons that I find compelling as to why the stories of Jesus in the Bible, the stories of Jesus in the gospels, are stories of truth, they're stories of fact. The first reason is this: the gospels were written too early to simply just be made up. And what I mean by that is they were written within 40 to 50 years of the events of Jesus' life. Now that might sound like a long time gap, but bear in mind that the people who wrote them had been doing nothing during those 40 to 50 years apart from repeating and telling everybody these stories. They began to write them down when they began to die, whether from natural causes or persecution. And at the time they wrote them down, there were still plenty of people who were alive from the events of those stories, who would be able to dispute if they had just simply made things up off the top of their head. So let me give you an example. One of my many claims to fame, and there are many, is that I used to live next door to a guy who knew Winston Churchill's old chauffeur. That's right. And let's say, obviously, that Winston Churchill's old chauffeur is no longer alive, but let's say 40 years ago, someone decides to write a biography of Churchill. And they write about how Churchill was a great wartime leader and he gave lots of great speeches. And then they say, on this one time, he fed 5,000 soldiers with a pork pie. If they put that in a biography of Winston Churchill, what would happen is Winston Churchill's old chauffeur, who was there, and a number of other people who would have been there, would stand up and say, hang on a second, that never happened. We know because we were there. Well, the Gospels, when they were written, were still written within that time frame. And so people, both Jesus' friends and his enemies, would have stood up and said, hang on a second, we were there, none of this stuff has happened. If Matthew just decided to completely fabricate stories, people would have objected. We've got no evidence that there's any sort of objection taking place. The other thing to bear in mind is the way that the Gospels are written. They're written expecting people to go and check the facts. So all of these studies have been done into the Gospels and about how they're based on eyewitness accounts and how they present themselves as eyewitness accounts. So there's a number of places. One would be Paul, the great apostle. He's on trial at one point and he says to the people who are asking him questions, hang on a second, these things were not done in a corner. They weren't hidden away. Go and ask some people. Elsewhere, he talks about how 500 people saw the risen Jesus, the resurrected. The sense of it is go and confirm this, go and ask. In Mark's Gospel, there's a number of references to kind of just really, they're a bit obscure. So at one point, in Mark chapter 15, someone comes and carries Jesus' cross for him as he's on his way to be crucified. And Mark writes in Mark chapter 15, verse 21, that this guy is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Who are Alexander and Rufus? When I read that, you think, well, who the heck are they? Well, cheers, Mark. That doesn't mean anything to me. Why would you include the father of Alexander and Rufus? We think the reason that's included is because Mark was writing for a community who would have known Alexander and Rufus. And so he says, like at that point, this guy's Alexander and Rufus's dad. So the people who were listening could have thought, or reading, could have thought, flip, this is Rufy's dad. He did that. I'll go and check. I'll go and ask him. He'd know the story. And so it's presented as if like, go and see, go and check. It's within the time frame of many people who would have still been around, who were around when Jesus was doing his thing. That's the first reason why I'm sure it's completely made up. The second reason that I chuck out there is that there's an awful lot of evidence from outside of the Gospels, and by that I mean non-Christian sources who had no agenda in advancing Christianity, for the reliability of the message of the Gospels. So Nicky Gumbel lists them. I'm not going to go into all the sources, but Nicky Gumbel in his book on Alpha lists them. But these are things we know from people that weren't Christians. Things we know about Jesus. That he was considered to be a wise man. He was a revered teacher. He performed miracles. He was crucified. Pontius Pilate ordered that he was killed. It happened on the eve of Passover. That Christians believed that he was the Messiah, and that there was a Christian belief, at least alluded to, that Jesus was God. Coupled with that, evidence from people who had no interest in advancing Christianity confirming the basic beliefs of Christians, you've got archaeological evidence of what's going on in the Gospels. And we don't have time to dig into all of it, But if you were to look at some of it, for example, Pontius Pilate, for a long time, there was no evidence outside of ancient writings that there was a guy called Pontius Pilate who existed. And then in 1961, we dug up something in a place called Caesarea, which is where Pontius Pilate was. And it talks about Pontius Pilate. It talks about him being a proconsul. It's written there in stone. Until 1955, no one could find Nazareth. And we were getting a little bit worried because that's where Jesus purportedly grew up. No one could find it. And then in 1955, we found it. And we thought, phew. And again, from digging around, we could see easily that it existed long before the time of Jesus. Those are just a couple of many, many examples I could give that confirm specific details, both places and people, that are recorded in the Gospels. Now, does that prove everything that's in the Gospels? Of course it doesn't, and I'm not saying that it does. But what it does say to me, to my mind, is that this isn't just a story that's been fabricated off the top of somebody's head out of thin air. These are real people, real places, real dates, and a real basic story that's confirmed outside of Christian sources. So, that's the second reason. The third reason why I'm not sure this is all made up is because if these guys were in the habit of just making up a religion, they did a really bad job. I could have done, I think, a much better job of inventing a religion. So let's just have a look at some of the stuff that they say. First of all, they say God becomes a little person, like the infinite God of the universe becomes a tiny little baby. That's like me saying I'm going to become a tadpole, but it's more ridiculous than that. It's more bonkers than that, okay? So first of all, they say God becomes a person. Secondly, they think as they make up their religion, where should we have God born? And so what they do is they choose the Jewish equivalent of Slough for God to be born, a place called Bethlehem. Now today we have romanticized Bethlehem and we sing about it in our Christmas carols, but it's the back end of nowhere. You wouldn't want to be born in Bethlehem, and that's where God gets born. And he's born to a peasant girl who would have been humiliated because everybody thought she'd had sex outside of wedlock. And again, in that culture, that was incredibly shameful to have been accused of doing something like that. So that's how God is born. And then we think, okay, well, in this religion that you're making up, what happens next? Well, for the next 30 years, nothing at all. For the next 30 years, he's just a builder. He's just a carpenter wandering around. And then he begins to do his ministry. And this is getting a bit better because for a while he's quite successful and he does some miracles and he gives some talks. But then after a little while, it all goes horribly wrong because we kill him. And more than that, at the end, what's happening also is that the people that he's invested the most amount of time in, his 12 disciples, one of them betrays him, the other one denies ever knowing him, and the rest of them just completely abandon him. It's not exactly a persuasive picture for us to believe the truth that this guy is really God made flesh. And then you go on, and there's other things that I wouldn't have included, probably, some fairly counterproductive things if you're trying to persuade people that Jesus is God and you're just making stuff up for the sake of it. So a few other things you probably wouldn't include. I wouldn't include some of the passages that are in the Gospels about how Jesus doesn't know things. So there's one point where a question's asked to him and he just says, I don't know the answer to that. Only the Father knows. Another point is recorded that Jesus cannot do miracles. Again, if I'm making something up and I'm just trying to persuade you just about my made-up story, I wouldn't include bits that show that Jesus can't do stuff, and yet they put that stuff in the book. There are other things that I wouldn't include as well. Some of them would be to do with the leaders of the early church, who, bearing in mind, are the ones that testify to the truth of this. They're shown to be a bunch of morons half the time. They do not understand Jesus. They don't seem to understand anything. Another factor that's going on is the resurrection, which is really the linchpin of Christianity. When Jesus comes back from the dead, the first witnesses to the resurrection are women. And that might not seem a big deal today, but in that culture, this was wrong, but in that culture, women were not allowed to testify in a law court. Their testimony wasn't considered valid in that place. And yet, to testify to the greatest historical truth of Christianity, the first witnesses are women in a culture that wouldn't let them witness in a law court. Why would you put that in? Why would you make that up unless it's what happened? Another bunch of the stories that, again, probably I think I could have done a better job making up are the stories of the resurrection. So when Jesus appears to people, he does a whole load of things, but most of them seem to revolve around food. So there's this one occasion where they're all locked in a room, frightened, and Jesus appears into them. Peace be with you, is what he says. And then they don't really believe, they're not really sure. And so Jesus says, have you got any food? And they say, yes, we do. We've got some fish. And he eats the fish. And that's the moment the lights come on for them. They're like, oh my word, he's alive. And I think, if I were making a religion up, would I hinge it all on a piece of fish? Would that be the kind of the big thing that I'd say? When he appears to them at Lake Galilee, this is at the end of John's Gospel. Again, he does miracle with fish, and then he cooks them breakfast. Now, if I was making up a religion and I said God had come back from the dead, would the first thing I'd say be, and then he made me some Frosties? You know, and we sat there and we had breakfast. I had orange juice, Tropicana and some Frosties, and we had a lovely conversation. I wouldn't go there. I'd make up more impressive stories. I'd say we flew around Israel. I'd say he turned the Sea of Galilee into Coke Zero. I'd come up with something impressive, and they just tell these incredibly normal stories about what the risen Jesus did, because that's what he did, because that's how it happened. And they're just trying to record what happened. They're not just making stuff up, as far as I can tell. Reason number 4. Reason number 3 is that they did a very bad job of just making stuff up. Reason number 4, why I don't think they just made it all up, is because they died for what they believed. And people don't seem to die for things that they just make up. You know, if I was making up a story, you put a gun to my head, that's the point where I'd say, only joking. But they don't do that. And so James, who's one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, is killed in 61 AD. Paul is beheaded in 64 AD. Peter, the rock on whom the church was built, is crucified upside down in 65 AD. And there are stories of the persecutions of Christians under Emperor Nero, and you can read accounts of it. He fed them to dogs and he fed them to lions. And one of the things he used to do is use us as torches in his garden party. So he would take Christians, he would tie them to posts, cover them in flammable liquid, and set fire to them while the guests drank cocktails. Christians died for this. Now, does that prove it's true? It doesn't. But it does say to me they weren't just making it up. They thought this was truth. And the 5th reason why I think there's something in this is because of the result. Look at what happens. Now, yes, we can say, well, people die for things that aren't true, and of course that's the case. People die today for things that I don't believe to be true. But I just make this point. First of all, maybe they were honestly hoodwinked, maybe they were just deluded. They genuinely believed it, but they were deluded. First of all, it's a lot of people to delude. Jesus appears on 11 separate occasions to over 500 different people. Secondly, if you wanted to disprove the resurrection, if it never happened, it's easy. You go to the tomb, you find the body, but there's no record of anybody ever producing his body. No one could ever find it. Thirdly, look at the content. This is what I mean when I say the result convinces me. Look at the content. Look at what's written. Have you read these books, the books about Jesus? Somebody said this stuff. Somebody said it, because it's here. It's staring at us out of the pages. So somebody said, love your enemies. And somebody said, let the little children come to me, don't hinder them. Somebody said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? Somebody said those things because they stare at us from the pages of this book, and whoever said them was gigantic, and whoever said them was huge, and whoever said them, we've built much of Western morality on his... So somebody said it. And another thing, look at the disciples. Look at what happens to them. This is a deeply unimpressive group of people. They are terrified after Jesus has been killed. They're trapped. They lock themselves in a room because of their fear. For 3 years, they've invested their hope in the person of Jesus, and then he's just been taken away from them, and they think they're going to be next. They think they're going to be executed next, so they're hiding and fearful and afraid. And suddenly, something happens to them that means that they come to life. They find this boldness and this courage, and this movement begins that within 300 years comes to dominate the world as it was then. Something has to have happened to them, and part of me struggles to understand how there could have been that transformation without God being involved. I'm not sure, in fact, I don't believe that these books were just made up. I think they're accurate historical records of the person of Jesus, and that he is who the Gospels say he is. And for those of us who are Christians, it's time for us to have confidence in this truth, to remind ourselves why we hold it to be precious. Because I want us to trust the fact that when it says God became a person, it's because he did. That when we read Jesus' teachings, it is the teaching of God made man. When we see his miracles, it's a testimony to the character of our God. When we witness the fact that he was crucified and he came back to life again, that's what happens. We can be confident about these events. And more than that, what it means also for me is that I can be confident when it says in God's book, he will not abandon us, it's because he won't. When it says in God's book that he loves us forever, it's because he does. When it says in God's book, when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, it's because he is. And the final thing I'll say is, if this is about events, if this is about facts and things that actually happened, one of the things that it means is that this cannot be true for me and not true for you. It means it cannot be true for us and not true for our neighbor, or the guy that sits next to us at work, or the girl that we're friends with. If it's a fact, then it's true for all of us. It's like saying, England won the World Cup in 1966, but they didn't just win it for me and not for you. It's something that actually happened. It's true for all of us. This is true for all of us. As his followers, we can be confident in his word. Why don't I finish with a prayer? Father, we thank you that you are who the Bible says you are, and that we can glory and have confidence in that truth. And I pray for all of us that we would come to know you more deeply and to walk with you more nearly. Amen. This has been God Speaks Today. Thanks so much for joining us. See you next time.